Tonight we walk into a hall so bright with candlelight that your eyes almost sting, the flames bouncing off polished silver and gilded goblets until the whole place feels like a jewelry box left open in the dark. You stand there, in robes far heavier than you'd like, half wishing you could sneak off in slippers instead of the stiff leather shoes creaking on the marble floor. The air smells of roasted game, spiced wine, and just a touch of sweat from too many high-ranking churchmen stuffed together in one echoing chamber. And in the middle of all this, the real tension isn't about heresy or politics, it's about whether you should pick up that gleaming fork or stick with your fingers. You probably won't survive this without making someone glare at you like you've just denied the Trinity. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You slide closer to the long table where cardinals gather, their crimson robes spilling like wine across the benches. The host of the evening, a portly man with rings so heavy he could double as a human chandelier, gestures for the first course. Servants hurry forward, balancing platters of roasted pheasant, glazed fruits, and thick hunks of bread. It should be peaceful, but you sense tension simmering hotter than the stew bowls, because tonight, the utensils themselves are the scandal. A fork glints beside one plate. Only one. The man who owns it leans back with a smirk, daring the others to object. You hear a sharp whisper from his neighbor, that two-pronged devil's tine mocks the very hand of God. The smirking cardinal replies, better a devil's tine than greasy fingers. The chuckle that follows sounds like the spark of kindling, the kindling being centuries of habit and a dash of pride. You quickly realize this isn't just about hygiene. In Renaissance Italy, table manners are a battlefield. Knives double as symbols of masculinity and power, while forks still strike many as effeminate or, worse, blasphemous. Historians still argue whether clerics truly believed God preferred bread to be torn by hand, or if that was just a sanctimonious excuse to resist change. Either way, in this hall, the debate is less academic and more personal. You try not to stare, but the knife drama is equally sharp. These blades are not butter spreaders, they're long, pointed, and perfectly capable of sliding from cutting mutton to settling insults without a pause. A century earlier, duels had erupted over less, one monk's careless laugh, another's misstep. So here you sit, surrounded by men of faith who treat dinner like a polite chess match with occasional threats of checkmate via stabbing. It's the world's strangest potluck meets mob meeting, minus the Tupperware. A servant offers you bread, and you notice the subtle choreography of hands. Some cardinals tear with dramatic vigor, as if proving their loyalty to tradition. Others delicately slice with knives that flash like miniature swords. And then, of course, the lone fork user twirls fruit on his prongs, savoring each motion as if he's staging a performance. You nearly laugh, it's less a meal and more a theatrical rehearsal for the passion of the pastry. Beyond the table, musicians play lutes and recorders, trying to soften the tension. The melody drifts, almost drowning out the murmurs of debate. One man argues that knives at the table invite sin, given their potential for violence. Another insists that cutting food into smaller, manageable bites is a sign of refinement. Meanwhile, greasy fingers leave streaks of oil down velvet sleeves, and you wonder if anyone notices the irony. These same men debate the holiness of utensils while leaving stains that no laundress could possibly scrub out. Quirky details keep surfacing. You overhear someone claim that Venetian hosts once shamed guests who brought forks by saying, "God gave us fingers for a reason." You also catch a rumor about a Byzantine princess who scandalized her Italian hosts by refusing to touch food with her hands at all, relying only on her golden fork. The memory lingers like a spicy aftertaste, proof that even the smallest tool can stir a cultural storm. You sip watered wine, noticing how the table divides into factions: fork sympathizers, knife purists, and those who prefer to dodge the debate by eating as little as possible. It feels like a papal conclave, but instead of smoke rising from a chimney, you expect to see breadcrumbs flying like snow. At one point, the smirking fork user drops his utensil deliberately, letting it clang against the floor. The sound slices through the music, through the whispers, through the thick heat of roasted meats. Every eye shifts toward him. He shrugs, spreads his hands as if to say, "What?" Tools slip. But you know what he's really saying: "This fork isn't going away, gentlemen." You catch yourself grinning despite the tension. Because here, in the candlelit chaos of a Renaissance feast, you realize the truth. The greatest clashes don't always happen in battlefields or cathedrals. Sometimes, they happen at dinner tables, over silver, sauce, and the stubborn refusal to admit you just don't like licking grease off your fingers in front of your rivals. The argument spills forward like wine tipped from an overfilled cup, and you find yourself leaning closer, ears tuned not to the lute players but to the muttered accusations circling the table. The fork, simple, harmless, shiny, is suddenly a theological grenade. One cardinal raises his bushy eyebrows so high they nearly vanish beneath his hat and declares that the fork is nothing short of an insult to God himself. After all, he says, the Creator gave humanity fingers to grasp food, and to replace them with cold metal prongs is to scorn divine design. His neighbor, unfazed, licks oil from his thumb and replies, "Perhaps God also gave us brains to improve on the fingers." The table crackles with laughter and a few gasps, because that answer straddles the line between wit and heresy. You pick at a grape, careful not to look too invested, though inside you're fascinated. It feels absurd, grown men in embroidered robes debating what you'd use for eating salad today. Yet in this candlelit hall, it's deadly serious. Some clergy truly believe the fork reeks of vanity. One recalls with a shudder that Byzantine women use them daily, claiming that such prongs encourage decadence, indulgence, and even lust. Imagine that, a tool so scandalous it could be blamed for desire. You half expect someone to accuse spoons of whispering lies into the night. Historians still argue whether these objections were sincere or just excuses to cling to tradition. Was the fork really condemned as sinful, or did clerics just dislike looking awkward while learning to use one? Because, let's be honest, the first few stabs often send food skittering off the plate. And what man of rank wants to look like a toddler with a rattle while the choir watches? You suspect some moral outrage was really bruised ego disguised as holiness. Still, the rhetoric is sharp. One bishop warns that forks separate man from the earth, breaking the sacred bond of touch between food and eater. Another insists that greasy fingers remind diners of humility, since Christ himself surely tore bread without cutlery. You're tempted to raise your hand and ask, yes, but did Christ ever face a steaming bowl of tagliatelle? Better not. Humor might get you excommunicated, or worse, denied dessert. The lone fork advocate waves his utensil like a banner of progress. Look, he says, spearing a cube of melon, would it not honor the Creator to preserve cleanliness? To keep silk unstained? To savor without mess? His argument has weight, especially when you glance down at your own oil-slicked sleeves. One clergyman scoffs, muttering that only vain men fear stains, while true holy men wear dirt like medals. Yet you notice that same scoffer subtly dabs his robe with a napkin when he thinks no one sees. Hypocrisy, thy name is roasted goose grease. The tension rises when another cardinal recalls the tale of Maria Argyropolina, the Byzantine princess who married into Venetian nobility. She shocked her hosts by refusing to eat with her hands, preferring golden forks instead. Her critics whispered that she mocked God's gift of fingers and declared her sinful. Some even claimed her early death was divine punishment for the arrogance of cutlery. Quirky as it sounds, the rumor lingered like garlic in the air, proof, for these men, that forks were cursed. And yet, others aren't so sure. If her death was caused by forks, one man chuckles, then perhaps knives are responsible for gout, and spoons for baldness. Laughter bubbles, though nervously, because too much mirth in the wrong direction could be remembered. The music pauses for a new course, steaming bowls of noodles tangled in butter and herbs. Ah, here's the true battlefield. Fingers are clumsy, knives unhelpful, spoons laughably insufficient. You watch as some clerics try to pinch strands, others saw at them like wood, and the fork user simply twirls a neat bite, lifts it to his lips, and smiles. He has them cornered. No prayer can save greasy fingertips from this mess. You feel the weight of centuries pressing in. What seems like petty table drama will, in time, reshape European dining. But here, tonight, it's just men bickering, clinking goblets too hard, puffing out cheeks in wounded pride. You can't help grinning at the thought that future generations might laugh at them just as you're laughing now. Still, you tuck the thought away, better not to voice it. Sarcasm is safer when you're not surrounded by men with daggers masquerading as dinner knives. And so the sinful fork debate lingers long past dessert. You lean back, listening as voices rise and fall like tides, realizing that for these cardinals, the question of utensils is more than mere etiquette. It's about identity, tradition, and the terrifying possibility that holiness might have to share a plate with convenience. The night deepens, and so does the murmur of voices bouncing across the banquet hall. You think the matter of forks has reached peak absurdity until knives take the stage. You glance at the blade resting beside your trencher, long enough to slice meat yet sharp enough to turn an insult into a medical emergency. And you notice the way cardinals handle theirs, fingers caressing hilts, eyes glancing sideways, as though every man half expects dinner to transform into a duel. The official line, at least from the pious mouths of these clerics, is that knives are necessary for carving meat, nothing more. Yet the unofficial truth is far sharper. Knives at the table double as subtle warnings. I can cut my food, and I can cut your argument short, if pressed. You shift uncomfortably. It's less Last Supper and more Last Nerve. A plump bishop with a booming voice insists knives are merely tools of hospitality, while another with a hawk-like nose leans forward and hisses that leaving such blades on the table tempts sin. Historians still argue whether the Church genuinely feared violence at meals or whether such objections were just another polite excuse to mask deep rivalries. Either way, you suspect the hawk-nosed fellow would happily demonstrate his point if provoked. And provocation comes swiftly. A younger cleric clumsily saws through his lamb shank, splattering gravy across his neighbor's sleeve. The victim glares as if doused with heresy, and you hold your breath, certain the blade will leap from culinary to combat. Instead, the younger man blushes crimson, stammers an apology, and quickly wipes his knife with exaggerated piety. The moment passes, but the tension remains, vibrating under the candlelight like a lute string pulled too tight. You lean back, taking in the room. Knives here are not uniform. Some are simple steel with wooden handles, but others gleam with gilded hilts and etched scripture, as if blessing the blade makes it less dangerous. One even sparkles with tiny jewels along the handle, clearly more vanity than utility. A quirky detail hits you. Certain Renaissance hosts gave knives as gifts, but tradition demanded they be redeemed with a coin to avoid symbolically severing the friendship. Imagine that, buying your own present so your friend doesn't feel cursed. The musicians pluck at a livelier tune, perhaps to distract from the blade anxiety. You wonder how many of these lutes will survive the night without being smashed against someone's head. The humor of it almost makes you snort into your wined cardinals with bellies like overstuffed cushions, puffing about holiness, while carrying miniature swords at the table. It's as if they've mistaken dinner for a rehearsal of Julius Caesar. The smirking fork advocate from earlier joins in now, tapping his knife against his goblet. "Gentlemen," he drawls, "we quarrel over forks, but I see no one condemning knives. Which, pray, has shed more blood?" A ripple of murmurs surges like a sudden draft. You feel goosebumps prick your arms. It's a dangerous point, because everyone in the room knows duels and stabbings are not rare. One wrong glare, one clumsy toast, and dinner could turn into a headline. Cardinal calves rival alongside roast venison. A white-bearded elder clears his throat, trying to restore dignity. He argues that knives symbolize discipline. Cutting food into neat, controlled pieces is a mark of civilization. He warns that eating like beasts, tearing with teeth and nails, is the true barbarity. The irony doesn't escape you, since a few minutes earlier he gnawed a chicken bone with the enthusiasm of a starving wolf. Still, his voice carries weight. But another counters with equal fervor: knives invite pride. A man who wields his blade too proudly forgets humility. You can't help but grin at that, picturing humility in the form of gravy stains dripping down embroidered cuffs. And all the while, you sense the undercurrent. Knives are not just utensils. They're personal weapons, status symbols, and metaphors for sharper disagreements about wealth, theology, and power. Every polished blade on this table reflects not only candlelight but centuries of tension. You can't decide whether to marvel or to keep your hands well clear. Probably both. The servants bring in another round of roasted meats, laying platters heavy with pork, veal, and duck. The carving begins. Some men slice delicately, as if auditioning for an etiquette manual. Others hack with grim determination, splattering sauce like battlefield blood. You stifle a chuckle. It's the closest thing to performance art this feast will ever see. A story surfaces, murmured from one end of the table. A French king once ordered knives to be blunted at court because too many guests used them to pick their teeth or threaten their neighbors. Whether the tale is true or not, it carries weight here, whispered like a cautionary parable. Forks may scandalize, but knives still terrify. You sip your watered wine again, careful not to meet anyone's eye too long. For a fleeting moment, you imagine reaching for your own blade, not to duel, but to carve yourself a neat slice of roast duck. Still, you hesitate, knowing even the smallest slip might be mistaken for a challenge. Dinner, you realize, is as much about choreography as consumption. And so, under the vaulted ceiling, the argument about knives simmers on, blending theology, tradition, and the unspoken fear that at any moment, dinner might cut deeper than anyone intends. The clatter of knives and forks dies down just enough for words to cut sharper than steel, and you realize you've stumbled into a theater of etiquette disguised as supper. The food is plentiful: pheasants with glossy skin, steaming bowls of beans, pears poached in honey, but no one's really here for the taste. They're here to prove a point with every greasy bite or every polished gesture. Cardinals in velvet robes, their hats tilted just so, bicker like children who can't decide whether it's cooler to eat with chopsticks or bare hands. You watch one man tear into bread with theatrical vigor, holding up the chunk as if it were a relic from the Holy Land. His lips curl into a satisfied smirk, as if to say, "See? Pure. Untainted. No fork required." Across from him, another cardinal daintily presses his knife against cheese, carving neat squares that slide onto a trencher. His expression is equally smug. Civilized men slice. Barbarians claw. And somewhere in the middle, your fork advocate from earlier twirls pasta strands with the patience of a monk illuminating manuscripts. It's ridiculous, but riveting. You feel the room split into camps: greaser-finger traditionalists versus polished silver progressives. Each faction has its champions. The traditionalists cite biblical precedent: Christ broke bread with bare hands, Moses never fiddled with cutlery, the apostles didn't pause mid-sermon to polish forks. The progressives counter with humanist flair, quoting Aristotle and Cicero, claiming that rational beings refine not only thought but also manners. Historians still argue whether these debates were earnest theology or simply excuses for showing off, but tonight, both sides act as if salvation depends on posture at the table. One man insists that messy fingers remind you of humility, a sign that food is a gift from God rather than a performance. Another retorts that wiping duck fat on silk sleeves doesn't look humble at all, it looks sloppy. You can't help but snicker under your breath, picturing humility delivered via laundry bills. A quirky story slips into the chatter. In Florence, a noblewoman once refused to attend a banquet because she found the hosts too barbarous. They ate entire chickens with bare hands, juices dripping down their arms. Animals at the trough, she allegedly declared. The gossip still circulates years later, proof that etiquette is never just etiquette, it's ammunition for social warfare. The musicians pluck at their lutes, but even their melody can't drown the rising heat of voices. Cardinals lean closer, gesturing with oily hands or gleaming blades, their words tumbling over each other like dice spilled across a gaming table. You think for a moment how absurdly human it all is. Men who pray for hours, debate scripture until dawn, now snarling over whether cutting bread is prideful or pious. It's theology in crumbs. At one end of the table, the fork advocate clears his throat, as if preparing to deliver a homily. "Gentlemen," he begins, spearing a slice of pear, "is it not hypocrisy to wash our hands before prayer but refuse tools that keep them clean at supper?" A ripple of murmurs spreads, some approving, others scandalized. His rival shoots back, "Christ washed feet, not forks. Cleanliness of soul outweighs cleanliness of sleeve." The retort lands with a thud, but the smug fork user simply pops the pear into his mouth and smiles. You glance at the servants, silent shadows moving between the tables, refilling goblets, wiping spills. They exchange sly looks, as if to say, "Our masters preach humility but argue like tavern drunks." You almost want to laugh aloud, but you bite your tongue. Better not to end the evening as dessert. The arguments grow pettier as the night stretches. One bishop insists that tearing bread by hand unites diners in a communal act, a symbolic echo of Christ breaking bread at the Last Supper. Another counters that carving bread neatly prevents waste, which honors God by respecting abundance. You nearly roll your eyes. Bread is bread, you think, unless it's suddenly a battleground for eternal truth. Still, you can't deny the energy of it all. Candlelight flickers on ruby rings, shadows stretch across frescoed walls, and the air thickens with roasted meats and righteous indignation. Each statement lands like a drumbeat, each rebuttal like cymbals clashing. It's noisy, messy, absurd, and oddly captivating. By the time dessert arrives, honey-drenched figs and almond pastries, you realize this is less a dinner than a ritual of rivalry. The Cardinals aren't really trying to resolve anything. They're sparring, parading intellect and wit, drawing invisible lines between those who stain and those who shine. And you, caught in the middle, savor the irony. Men sworn to simplicity wrapped in velvet, men sworn to humility arguing whether cleanliness is vanity. It dawns on you that the utensils themselves are merely props in a grander play. Forks, knives, greasy fingers, they're all symbols, shorthand for loyalty, pride, or piety. And though the table groans under the weight of food, the true feast is this drama of etiquette wars, fought in velvet robes under candlelight, every gesture a declaration, every bite a manifesto. The banquet hall begins to smell heavier now, a stew of wine, roasted venison, and overheated candle wax, and still the conversation churns like a pot left to boil too long. Your ears catch a new thread of bickering, this time about where forks even came from. Because in truth, the fork is not a homegrown Italian invention. It slipped across borders, carried on trade winds, tucked into the dowries of Eastern brides, and lodged itself uncomfortably in Western kitchens like an uninvited guest who refuses to leave. One cardinal leans forward, his voice carrying the weight of rumor and disdain. "These instruments," he sneers, tapping at the fork resting in his neighbor's hand, "are foreign contraptions. Imported from Byzantium. Shall we also import their perfumes, their jewels, their questionable morals?" His tone drips like sour wine, as if a tool of dining carries the sins of empires. The fork user chuckles softly, twirling his utensil with the same flair he used on noodles earlier. "If cleanliness be a sin," he says, "then I will happily confess." His words land lightly, but you notice the shift in the room, because calling something foreign here is no small insult. In an age of city-states jostling for pride and independence, foreign is code for dangerous, effeminate, or corrupt. Historians still argue whether the resistance to forks was rooted in genuine xenophobia or simple conservatism. Was it really the association with Byzantium that bothered Italians, or was that just an easy excuse to sneer at change? You're left imagining an alternate universe where forks had originated in Rome. Would the same men now be declaring them holy relics? A quirky tale slips through the chatter. Centuries earlier, in Constantinople, courtiers dined with golden forks so tiny and delicate they looked more like jewelry than utensils. Venetian traders, upon witnessing this, carried the idea home, but instead of admiration, it sparked ridicule. People whispered that Eastern habits made men soft, indulgent, more concerned with appearances than appetite. Imagine mocking someone for not dripping sauce all over themselves. That's the Renaissance for you. The longer you watch, the clearer it becomes that the fork isn't just about food, it's about identity. To use one is to align yourself, however subtly, with the East. To reject one is to proclaim your loyalty to tradition, to Christ, to Italian pride. A man who wields a fork in public risks whispers behind his back, is he too vain? Too foreign? Too proud? The conversation around you twists tighter, fueled by cups of spiced wine. One cardinal slams his goblet down, sloshing liquid onto the tablecloth. "Every luxury weakens us," he cries. "First silk, then forks, then who knows what? Shall we drink from golden straws like Persians?" His words draw nods from some, laughter from others. You glance at his jeweled cross glittering under the candles and bite back a smirk. Luxuries are fine, apparently, as long as they hang from your neck. And yet, not everyone shares his suspicion. A quieter voice, one belonging to a bishop with ink-stained fingers, murmurs, "But are we not heirs of Rome? Did Rome not borrow from Greece? And Greece from Egypt? If we fear imports, we fear civilization itself." His words ripple out like a stone tossed in water. The room grows momentarily still. Though not silent, you hear the crackle of torches, the faint shuffle of servants shifting nervously in the shadows. Then, predictably, the storm resumes. Voices rise again, clashing like cymbals. Some thunder against the infiltration of foreign ways, others defend the fork as a natural step in mankind's endless quest to refine. You sit back, cradling your goblet, marveling at the way a dinner table can become a parliament, a pulpit, a battlefield, all over two prongs of polished metal. Servants bring trays of new dishes, stuffed artichokes drizzled with oil, their spiny leaves inviting careful handling. You watch the drama unfold in slow motion. The fork user lifts his utensil, plucks a leaf, and dips it neatly without staining his robe. Across the table, a traditionalist pinches his leaf, dribbles oil down his wrist, and pretends not to notice. His scowl deepens. You almost laugh out loud. It's performance art at this point, a morality play in oil stains. The irony, of course, is that these cardinals are surrounded by other imports: pepper from India, sugar from Cyprus, almonds from Spain. Every bite on the table is a foreigner of sorts, smuggled across seas by merchants who care little for theological debates. You take a bite yourself, tasting cinnamon so sharp it tickles your nose, and think, if forks are sinful, then so is half the pantry. Yet the rhetoric won't let go. Forks, in their gleaming simplicity, have become symbols of foreign infiltration, easy scapegoats for fears of decadence. To reject them is to protect tradition. To accept them is to risk suspicion of betrayal. And so the hall hums on, a chorus of velvet-clad voices, arguing not about pheasants or pears but about identity itself, one prong at a time. The hall hums louder now, not with lute strings or laughter but with the unmistakable slurp of noodles. The servants have returned carrying great steaming bowls of pasta, ribbons of tagliatelle glistening with butter and herbs, strands so long they seem to mock anyone foolish enough to approach them barehanded. You watch as the first bowls are set down, steam curling upward like incense, and you realize this is where the fork earns its trial by fire. The fork advocate is ready. He lifts his shining pronged companion and twirls with the grace of a maestro. The pasta coils neatly, obediently, and he raises it to his lips in a single bite. Silence drops across the table like a velvet curtain. Then he smirks, chewing slowly, as if to say, "Gentlemen, behold the future." Across from him, the traditionalists are suddenly in trouble. One tries to pinch the noodles with his fingers, but the strands slip, slither, and collapse back into the bowl. Another attempts to lift them with a knife, balancing like a juggler, only for the noodles to slide down in a greasy heap. A third goes for broke, leaning forward to slurp directly from the edge of the bowl. The sound, loud, wet, unapologetic, makes half the table cringe and the other half snicker. You nearly choke on your wine, trying not to laugh too hard. This is the pasta revolution, and you can feel it in your bones. Forks may be scandalous, sinful, even foreign, but they're useful. And usefulness has a way of steamrolling moral outrage. Historians still argue whether pasta spread forks or forks spread pasta, but tonight, watching bishops flounder like cats trying to catch eels, you suspect it's pasta that holds the upper hand. The smell of butter and cheese mingles with the chatter. One bishop wipes his chin with exaggerated dignity after a particularly disastrous slurp and mutters, "Perhaps God never intended man to eat such stringy food." Another retorts, "Perhaps God intended man to invent better tools." The exchange sparks laughter, then nervous silence, because every joke here carries a barb, every jest a challenge. A quirky tidbit floats your way. Someone recalls that in Naples, street vendors sold noodles so messy that locals joked you needed an extra hand just to eat them. The fork, when it finally took hold, was hailed as that third hand. You can't help but grin at the thought, an extra hand sprouting from the table, ghostly and efficient, solving centuries of sauce stains. The drama unfolds like theater. The fork user twirls serenely, always neat, always clean, while his rivals grow red-faced with frustration. One tries to improvise with a spoon, swirling pasta against it, but the spoon slips, clatters, and nearly tips his wine. Another mutters prayers under his breath, as if divine intervention might keep the noodles in line. Spoiler, it doesn't. You notice the servants again, lingering in the shadows, hiding smiles. They've surely seen this play before, noblemen pretending to master food while making fools of themselves. For them, the fork isn't a theological debate, it's a broom to sweep up fewer stains. But they say nothing, knowing better than to interrupt a roomful of egos locked in mortal combat with tagliatelle. The musicians pause, letting the slurping symphony stand alone. It's absurdly comic, a moment that feels like satire written centuries before satire became fashionable. And yet, beneath the humor, there's weight. You sense it. This is the turning point. Tradition may sneer, theology may wag its finger, but practicality, like pasta, twists and twirls until it finds a way forward. One cardinal, perhaps tired of the mess, leans back and declares, "The fork is unnatural. Yes, but so too are spectacles, yet we do not condemn them." His words hang in the air, bold, dangerous. Another retorts, "Spectacles serve the eyes. Forks only serve vanity." But the laughter that follows feels weaker, less certain, as though even the stanchest finger-eaters sense the tide turning. You picture future dinners, forks at every plate, pasta twirling with elegance, no more crimson sleeves stained with butter. The thought makes you smile. For now, though, the battle rages on, noodles clinging to robes, sauce dripping down fingers, and one smug cardinal twirling away, winning the war one strand at a time. The noodles vanish at last, though not without casualties: sauce-stained cuffs, splattered tablecloths, and at least one cardinal who looks as though he's fought a losing duel with a butter churn. But the room doesn't quiet down. No, the energy shifts. With stomachs full and pride bruised, the argument turns philosophical, sharper than any blade. It's no longer just about forks versus fingers, it's about the very act of cutting food at all. You hear one heavy-set cardinal slam his palm onto the table. Bread, he declares, must be torn, not sliced. Christ broke bread with his hands. To cut bread is to cut tradition. His cheeks puff red, like a man who has been saving that line for months, maybe years, waiting for his moment. Across from him, another cleric arches his brow and calmly replies, "And yet, dear brother, is it not wasteful to leave crumbs scattered like ash? To slice bread neatly is to honor God's bounty." The clash is immediate, one side thundering about sacred tearing, the other about civilized slicing. Historians still argue whether such debates genuinely consumed the clergy or whether they were exaggerated later for comic effect. But tonight, to your ears, the tension is real. Bread here is not bread, it's theology in crust form. And every loaf brought to the table becomes another chance for someone to stake their soul on a crumb. You glance down at your trencher, that flat hunk of stale bread used as a plate. It soaks up juices from the meats, a delicious sponge that doubles as dinnerware. One bishop bites straight into his trencher, juices running down his chin, daring anyone to call him unrefined. Another carefully carves his into small squares, stacking them like dice, each bite precise. The contrast is almost comical: feral wolf at one end, mathematician at the other. A quirky tale surfaces from the far side of the table. Someone recalls a nobleman so obsessed with tearing bread by hand that he forbade knives near loaves entirely. Guests were forced to rip at stubborn crusts with their fingers until their knuckles ached. The man's cook, weary of the spectacle, secretly pre-sliced loaves in the kitchen, hiding his sin like contraband. You imagine the relief of those guests, tearing miraculously easy bread, nodding piously while crumbs sprinkled like confetti. The fork advocate, not missing a chance to stir the pot, twirls what remains of his fruit with his gleaming utensil and asks, "If bread must only be torn, shall we also bite meat straight from the bone? Or gnaw cheese wheels whole?" His sarcasm hangs heavy, sweet as honey. Some chuckle, some scowl, and you notice one traditionalist gripping his knife a little tighter, as though tempted to demonstrate exactly what gnawing might look like on his opponent. The argument broadens. Should food be presented whole, honoring its natural form, or cut into manageable portions, showing man's mastery over chaos? Is the act of slicing refinement, or arrogance? It sounds absurd, but here in this hall, it's the sort of debate that could decide alliances, favors, reputations. Every gesture with knife or hand feels like a vote cast in an invisible election. You take a sip of wine, letting the sweetness linger, and watch as the table transforms into a courtroom. Every loaf, every hunk of cheese, every dripping joint of meat becomes evidence. A bishop declares that slicing food reduces gluttony by forcing smaller bites. His neighbor retorts that it encourages vanity, as diners spend more time admiring neat portions than savoring God's gift. You nearly laugh into your cup, imagining a saintly debate in heaven: small bites or big bites, which is holier? Servants shuffle nervously, placing new platters on the table. A roasted boar, its skin crisp and golden, arrives with a knife already lodged into its side. The symbolism is too juicy to ignore. One man declares triumphantly, "See? Even the feast itself arrives pre-cut." Another retorts, "The knife is for carving, not eating." There is a difference. Voices rise, hands wave, sleeves dip into gravy. It's chaos with embroidery. And all the while, you sense what's at stake. This isn't just dinner, it's a duel of worldviews. To tear or to slice, to grip or to twirl, to cling to the sacred past or to march toward a polished, fork-twirling future. It's theology tangled in noodles, politics baked into bread, and pride dripping from every greasy finger. By the time the boar is carved and distributed, the table has split into dueling dining philosophies, neither side willing to yield. And you, caught in the middle, feel oddly entertained, like a spectator at the strangest joust imaginable. Knights clash with lances, yes, but here, cardinals clash with crumbs. The roasted boar dwindles, bones jutting like ruins after a siege, but the noise at the table only swells. Now the debate has slipped its leash entirely, roaming into politics. You realize quickly that forks and knives are more than cutlery, they're code. Every gesture with a blade or a prong signals wealth, status, and the whispered alliances that run like invisible rivers beneath the crimson robes. A thin, hawk-eyed cardinal jabs at a pear with his knife, then lets the fruit slide off as if to make a point. Utensils are for courtiers and kings, he announces. We are servants of God, not princes of vanity. His voice rings with moral thunder, but you notice the jeweled chain around his neck sparkles brighter than the candelabra. So much for humility. Across the table, the fork advocate smirks and raises his prongs like a tiny flag of rebellion. And yet, Your Eminence, do we not dine in halls of marble, drink wine sweeter than honey, and wear robes dyed at the price of peasants' lives? Let us not pretend that a fork is what offends heaven. The words ripple out, bold and dangerous. Some nod in secret agreement. Others glare daggers, or rather, knives. Historians still argue whether dining etiquette truly reflected political factions or whether later writers simply read too much into spilled gravy. But here, watching the sparks leap from eye to eye, you believe it. To side with forks is to align with progress, humanism, and perhaps even foreign trade. To side with greasy fingers is to stake loyalty to tradition, humility, and the Church's claim to moral authority. A single bite becomes a declaration. Which world do you belong to? The servants glide around, eyes lowered, but you catch the faint smirk of one as a bishop fumbles noodles into his beard. They know the truth. These debates are theater, and the real audience is each other. The food is just the stage, the utensils the props, and the applause comes in the form of nods and whispers from potential allies. A quirky story emerges mid-argument. One cardinal recalls that in Milan, a noble family once staged a dinner where every guest was given a fork of solid silver. Instead of delight, the gesture caused scandal. Rivals whispered that the family had become too rich, too proud, flaunting wealth where humility should reign. That same week, sermons across the city railed against vanity at table. The family, of course, quietly kept using their forks in private. You sip your wine and wonder how many men at this very table do the same, piously tearing bread in public, then gleefully twirling pasta at home. You almost laugh at the hypocrisy, but you stop yourself. After all, that's the game. Public feasts are not for eating, they're for signaling. And tonight, the signal is clear. Which way will the wind blow? The fork advocate's allies begin to grow bolder. One gestures with his silver utensil, saying, "Discipline at table reflects discipline of soul. If we can master food, we can master ourselves." His words hang in the air, impressive, but his gesture flicks a drop of wine onto his neighbor's robe. The irony is too delicious, you bite your tongue to keep from snorting. His opponent fires back, and if we grow too proud in mastering food, we lose the humility Christ demanded. Better a greasy sleeve than a polished soul gone rotten. Cheers rise from the traditionalists, fists thumping on the table. You picture the scene as a political cartoon, cardinals in velvet robes wrestling over a loaf of bread while angels shake their heads above. The room splits more visibly now. Some lean toward the fork users, nodding subtly, adjusting their utensils with cautious pride. Others cling to knives and fingers, muttering prayers as though every slice and tear is an act of defiance against corruption. And you, caught between them, feel like you're watching two armies march to war, armed not with steel but with sauce. It dawns on you that every utensil, every bite, is a vote. A fork signals curiosity, cosmopolitan taste, maybe even daring. A knife signals tradition, strength, caution. Fingers, messy and unashamed, signal piety or at least the performance of it. The table becomes a map of Europe in miniature, reformers on one side, conservatives on the other, a stew of alliances simmering in candlelight. And as the goblets empty and the arguments sharpen, you realize this truth: forks and knives aren't just about food. They're about power. Who holds it, who fears it, who dares to flaunt it. And in this grand hall, dripping with velvet and pride, the real meal isn't pheasant or pasta, it's politics served piping hot. The table looks like a battlefield now, smeared with sauces, scattered crumbs, and the occasional stubborn noodle clinging to a sleeve. But the debate hasn't cooled. In fact, it's heating faster than the wax dripping down the candelabra. You notice the forks themselves start to change, no longer plain tools of convenience, but weapons in an arms race of ostentation. One cardinal lifts his utensil with a flourish, and you catch a glint: gold. Pure gold, polished to a shine so blinding it could double as a sunbeam. His neighbor, not to be outdone, produces a fork with a mother-of-pearl handle, delicate as a seashell. A third, clearly enjoying the drama, slides out a knife encrusted with tiny gems that sparkle like stars every time he gestures. Suddenly, dinner looks less like supper and more like a jewelry exhibition. The murmurs shift. Some gasp in awe, others mutter about vanity and sin. The hawk-nosed traditionalist, who has been grumbling since the first course, nearly spits his wine. Utensils should be tools, not treasures, he declares. But his voice wavers, because his own knife bears an engraved hilt, and everyone knows it. Historians still argue whether Renaissance churchmen truly indulged in such flamboyance or whether satirists exaggerated their habits. Yet as you watch a jeweled knife catch the candlelight, you believe it. These men live in a world where appearances matter as much as theology, and where silverware becomes the latest stage to flaunt one's superiority. A quirky tidbit pops into the debate. Someone recalls that a certain duke once ordered forks carved from crystal. They looked magnificent until one shattered mid-supper, sending shards into a guest's lap. The court jester, quick on his feet, quipped, "Ah, a fork fit for angels, since mortals cannot hold it." You imagine the laughter, though also the terrified silence that likely followed when the duke scowled. Back in this hall, the ostentation escalates. One cardinal brags that his set of utensils was blessed by a bishop before ever touching food, as if consecrated forks somehow ward off indigestion. Another swears his knife was forged by the same smith who armed mercenaries in Milan. You nearly choke on your drink, who brags about eating cheese with a swordsmither's blade. The fork advocate twirls his plain silver prongs, unimpressed. "Gentlemen," he says dryly, "you argue against forks as sinful, then compete over whose is shinier. Perhaps the sin is not in the utensil but in the pride." His remark lands like a dropped plate, loud, impossible to ignore. Some nod thoughtfully, others glare daggers, literal and figurative. And still, the ostentation grows. A servant brings out a tray bearing a fork so ornate it might as well belong in a reliquary. The handle gleams with enamel, painted in miniature scenes of saints. Its owner, clearly smug, uses it to spear a grape as if to crown his victory. Yet the grape slips, bounces across the table, and rolls to a halt beside you. You suppress a laugh, thinking, divine punishment delivered in fruit form. The musicians strum, trying to restore calm, but the hall is buzzing now. Voices overlap, some praising artistry, others cursing vanity. The smell of roast meats lingers, yet no one pays it any mind. This is no longer dinner. It's an arms race in miniature, each cardinal trying to prove he owns the sharpest, prettiest, most God-approved utensil in the room. And beneath the sparkle, you sense the truth. Forks and knives are not just about eating, they're props in a performance of power. To wield a golden fork is to say, I can afford to eat differently from you. To flash a jeweled knife is to whisper, my blade is not just sharp, it is holy, blessed, untouchable. It's absurd, yes, but also deadly serious. You lean back, listening, watching, savoring the irony. These men, who preach humility from pulpits, now duel with gems and gilding, turning dinner into a contest sharper than steel. And you realize that, for all the food on the table, no one here is truly hungry except for status. The jeweled grape incident fades into laughter, but the undercurrent of tension remains. As the next platters arrive, pheasants glazed in honey, figs bursting with sweetness, the debate twists again. Now the focus sharpens not on the utensils themselves, but on the men who wield them. The room brims with whispers of hypocrisy, vanity, and who exactly deserves to dine with dignity. A broad-shouldered bishop, grease shining on his lips, points with his knife as though it were a scepter. Luxury belongs to kings and dukes. We, the servants of God, must not imitate their feasts. His words drip with righteousness, but you notice his goblet encrusted with rubies probably cost more than a peasant's farm. Another cardinal, fork glinting in his hand, raises an eyebrow. And yet you sip from jewels while condemning silver prongs? Curious logic, brother. The jab lands, and a ripple of chuckles spreads through the hall. Historians still argue whether Renaissance clergy genuinely believed their own rhetoric about humility, or whether they used it as armor while enjoying extravagance in secret. Tonight, though, you watch the mask slip in real time. Every accusation of vanity rebounds like a ricochet, striking the accuser just as hard. A quirky anecdote surfaces from one corner of the table. Someone recalls a visiting preacher who refused to eat with utensils at all, declaring that to use them was to mock the hand God gave you. The story might have carried weight if the same preacher hadn't also demanded the finest Venetian glass for his wine. You picture it, pious fingers in greasy meat, delicate goblet raised high, the contradiction shining brighter than the glass itself. The servants move swiftly, bringing fresh loaves, wiping the table, pretending not to overhear the rising accusations. One bishop huffs that forks are a lady's toy, fit only for vanity. His neighbor shoots back, and what of rings? Shall we rip those from our fingers as well? You sense the hypocrisy exposed like a raw wound. For every ornament condemned, another glittering reminder dangles from a robe or wrist. The fork advocate, perhaps emboldened by wine, leans forward. Luxury is not the fork, he says softly, almost gently, but the soul that lusts for praise. A plain fork may serve as humbly as a wooden bowl. A jeweled cup may damn as surely as gold. His voice, calm and steady, cuts through the noise sharper than any knife. The table falls silent for a heartbeat, the kind of silence that suggests everyone is calculating whether he's right or whether he's just outmaneuvered them rhetorically. And yet the argument quickly splinters again. One traditionalist insists that humility must be visible, performed in every gesture, so the flock may learn by example. Another counters that humility is inward, invisible, and cannot be measured by forks or fingers. You almost laugh, this is theology by way of a dining manual, philosophy stirred into a stew pot. Wine flows, loosening tongues. Some voices grow slurred, others sharp. A few men, too tired to argue further, gnaw quietly on bread while rolling their eyes at the bickering. You catch sight of one younger cleric, nervously mimicking whichever faction seems loudest at the moment. He slices bread with exaggerated care when knives are praised, then tears chunks barehanded when fingers are lauded. You suspect his true loyalty lies only with survival. By now, the debate has shifted from utensils to morality itself. Who is holier, the man who eats neatly with a fork, sparing stains, or the man who embraces grease and crumbs in defiance of vanity? Who sins more, the bishop with a jeweled knife or the bishop who preaches humility while sipping ruby-studded wine? The contradictions pile higher than the empty platters. You sip from your own cup, savoring the sweetness, and wonder how many of these men realize the comedy of their quarrel. They claim to serve God, yet tonight they serve vanity, politics, and the endless hunger for appearances. Forks and knives are no longer tools, they're mirrors, reflecting every hidden hypocrisy back into candlelight. And as the arguments stretch into the night, you feel the absurdity settle over you like a heavy cloak. The feast may end, the candles may burn low, but the tension between luxury and humility, between jeweled cups and greasy fingers, will never fade. Not in this hall, not in this century. The feast lurches onward, but the air in the hall has grown thick, less with smoke from the roasting hearth than with pride and bruised egos. The arguments have circled, spiraled, and doubled back until every point seems made and unmade a dozen times. And yet no one surrenders. That's when you notice it, the way their voices no longer rise in orderly turns but overlap, crackle, and break like firewood in a blaze. A cardinal slams his jeweled knife down so hard the tableware jumps. Enough of this foreign nonsense. The fork is an affront to custom, and custom is holy. His cheeks are flushed, his wine spilled, and his words ring like thunder, but then his neighbor, fork raised like a tiny lance, sneers back, then cast away your spectacles, cast away your clocks, cast away every invention that makes life easier. For custom's sake, let us all return to the caves. The laughter that follows is sharp, cruel, almost gleeful. Historians still argue whether such dramatic table fights truly erupted in public or whether these quarrels played out more in pamphlets and whispered sermons. But tonight you see it in flesh and flame, men who command armies of words in pulpits reduced to bickering like tavern drunks, though dressed in velvet and gold. A quirky tidbit flits through your mind. You once heard of a German abbot who forbade forks in his monastery not for theology, but because he claimed the prongs resembled the devil's pitchfork. You imagine him red-faced, waving a fork aloft like a cursed relic, monks nodding gravely as though Satan himself lurked in the cutlery drawer. Here, though, the arguments are sharper, bloodier in spirit if not in flesh. Two factions have formed outright. Fork users, smug and self-styled as progressives, clump together, twirling even humble scraps of bread as though to demonstrate their refinement. Finger loyalists and knife defenders huddle on the opposite side, sleeves stained, eyes blazing, proclaiming that humility is measured in grease. Between them lies a no-man's land of empty platters and toppled goblets. You glance around the table, half expecting someone to leap onto the bench and declare a duel right there. And in a sense, that's exactly what happens, not with swords, but with words sharpened to blades. One bishop cries, "A fork separates man from God's creation, makes him distant, untouchable." Another spits back, "Better distant than dribbling sauce down your chin like a barnyard beast." The hall erupts, half in cheers, half in scandalized gasps. The musicians strum frantically, hoping melody can smother tension, but their lute strings are swallowed by the storm. A servant drops a plate in the chaos, the crash echoing like a bell of doom. Still, no one calms. Instead, voices grow louder, gestures wilder. A fork is waved like a dagger, a knife thumped on the wood like a war drum. Wine stains spread across the cloth like battle maps. Grease smears on robes glisten under candlelight. The smell of roasted pheasant lingers sour with sweat and anger. You lean back, strangely exhilarated, watching men of God lose themselves in a war of spoons and splinters. And beneath the absurdity, you feel the weight. This isn't really about forks or knives anymore. It's about pride, tradition, fear of change, the eternal struggle between what was and what might be. The utensils are just the sparks, the fire has always been there. One younger cleric finally breaks, standing to shout above the roar, "Brothers, we argue over scraps of metal while the world burns outside these walls." His voice wavers, but it cuts through enough to silence the room for a breath. You hear the fire crackle in the hearth, the drip of wax down a candle, the hush of a hall that has forgotten it is only dinner. But only for a breath. Then the shouting resumes, fiercer than before, because nothing enrages men more than being reminded of their own foolishness. You sigh, knowing this could stretch deep into the night, voices hoarse, pride unbroken, forks and knives clattering like weapons in a war with no victor. And yet, in some sleepy corner of your mind, you admit it's oddly comforting. Human beings, no matter how grand their titles, are never far from squabbling over the dinner table. By now the hall smells of spilled wine, overripe fruit, and tempers frayed to the snapping point. The arguments have burned so hot that when they finally begin to ebb, the silence feels heavier than the noise. And into that silence slips the one thing no one expected, a whisper of the devil himself. A cardinal, his sleeves sticky with sauce, leans forward and mutters, "The fork, it is Satan's own tool." His voice carries just far enough to spark murmurs. Heads turn, eyes widen. The claim, half drunk or wholly serious, lands like a thunderclap in the exhausted room. Suddenly, all the earlier jokes about pitchforks and prongs feel less funny. Historians still argue whether people truly believed forks had infernal associations or whether this was just clever propaganda spread by traditionalists. But tonight, you watch the idea grow legs. One bishop nods gravely and recounts that in Venice, whispers spread that the fork's shape mimicked the weapon of demons. Another adds that Eve herself plucked the forbidden fruit by hand, never with a fork, and that to replace hands is to replace God's will. You nearly laugh, then swallow it, because the air has turned sharp, dangerous. And then comes the quirky tidbit, a tale of an overzealous preacher who once held a fork above the pulpit and cried, "See how it mocks the flames. 2 tines, 2 paths, pride or humility." The congregation gasped, some even fainted. The poor utensil was later tossed into a fire, as though roasting it might roast sin itself. You imagine the scene and almost choke on your drink at the absurdity, yet here, around this table, the same spirit lingers. The fork advocate doesn't miss a beat. He lifts his prongs with theatrical calm and says, if the devil favors forks, then surely knives, those blades of blood, must be his swords. The hall explodes again, half in laughter, half in scandalized groans. Some cross themselves, others slam fists, others chuckle into their cups. The tension teeters on the edge of farce. You notice one man, red-faced, muttering that only fingers are truly godly, for did not God himself sculpt Adam with his hands? The line sparks applause from the traditionalists, but also a few smirks, as though the image of God kneading clay with greasy digits is too comical to inspire reverence. The servants, bless them, continue to move quietly, clearing bones and platters, replacing goblets, all while pretending not to hear the whispers of hellfire at the high table. You wonder how many of them, in the kitchens, joke that the devil doesn't bother with forks at all, he eats with a spoon so he can scoop souls more efficiently. Still, the debate twists darker. One bishop, face stern, declares that to wield a fork is to act above one's station, as though denying the messiness of human nature. We are meant to wrestle with food as we wrestle with sin, he growls. Another fires back that cleanliness is next to godliness, and that forks preserve dignity, sparing man the stains of chaos. The hall trembles again, words like sparks striking against dry straw. You sip what remains of your wine and feel the absurdity wash over you. Demons, dignity, greasy sleeves, what began as noodles has spiraled into metaphysics. And yet, you sense the deeper truth. These men are terrified of change. If a fork can be branded as infernal, What else might follow? Books? Printing presses? Any tool that shifts the balance of power could be whispered into hell's possession. The musicians strike a softer tune, perhaps hoping to soothe the devil out of the room, but their strings quiver under the weight of fear and pride. Forks glint in candlelight, knives gleam, fingers twitch, and in the shadows you almost fancy you see horns curling, tails flicking, demons dining alongside bishops with wicked grins. But then someone sneezes, loud, wet, ungraceful, and the spell breaks. Laughter ripples, shoulders relax, and the devil retreats, at least for the moment. Once again, the hall is full of men arguing not with spirits but with each other, though the whispers of Satan's fork will linger long after the feast ends. The sneeze still echoes faintly when the argument tilts again, like a cartwheel spinning into new territory. By now, the wine is nearly gone, the platters stripped to bones and crumbs, yet the debate refuses to die. Instead, it lurches from theology to medicine, as though the physicians of Europe themselves have crept into the hall to offer opinions no one asked for. A balding bishop, dabbing at his nose with a silk kerchief, clears his throat. "I tell you," he says, voice wobbling with conviction, "forks are dangerous to health. The prongs carry sickness from food to mouth, bypassing the cleansing touch of the fingers." He nods to himself, satisfied, as though germs, centuries before their discovery, were his trump card. Immediately, another counters. "Nonsense. The fingers are filthier by far. Think of the dirt, the sweat, the oils. Forks are cleaner, more precise." His fork gleams as he gestures, sending droplets of gravy across the table like punctuation. A few men groan, wiping sleeves, others cheer. Historians still argue whether Renaissance diners truly debated hygiene in this way or whether such concerns were imposed retroactively by later writers. But here in the candlelight, you watch the pseudoscience spread like wildfire. Everyone suddenly becomes a physician, diagnosing forks and knives as though souls and stomachs were inseparable. A quirky tidbit surfaces amid the babble. One cardinal insists he once heard of a Florentine noble who demanded every guest dip their forks in vinegar between bites to ward off plague. "Better the sting of vinegar than the sting of death," he proclaims, puffing his chest. You imagine a hall of coughing nobles, forks dripping sour liquid, food tasting like pickled despair. Another man swears that knives, with their sharp edges, slice through the humors, balancing the body even as they cut meat. The claim is absurd, yet he delivers it with such gravity that several nod. Someone else mutters that fingers warm food with human touch, aiding digestion. You nearly laugh aloud, picturing an entire medical textbook on therapeutic finger grease. The fork advocate seizes the moment. If forks are dangerous, then let us also ban spoons. Who knows what poison lurks in their bowls? His sarcasm slices clean, and a few younger clerics chuckle despite themselves. But one elder rises, face stern, declaring, "Do not mock. Gluttony is fed by utensils, too easy, too efficient. The struggle with food is part of virtue." His words hush the hall, as though he's pressed a cold cloth to fevered brows. Yet the quiet doesn't last. A bishop fires back, so virtue is measured in sore stains, in fumbling like children at table. The laughter that follows is weary now, tinged with desperation. The hour is late, the debate circling endlessly, yet no one dares surrender. The servants pour the last of the wine, careful not to spill, eyes betraying fatigue. They must wonder how long these men can argue without collapsing. But you sense that for the diners, exhaustion only fuels them. The later the hour, the more dramatic the claims. One swears forks cause headaches. Another insists knives sharpen the intellect, as blade sharpens blade. A third proclaims greasy fingers ward off melancholy, though his argument is drowned in laughter. You lean back, cradling your goblet, and let it wash over you. Here is medicine not of science but of metaphor, where cutlery becomes cure or curse depending on who wields it. It is ridiculous, yes, but also strangely human. When facts fail, people reach for stories, for logic stitched from fear and hope alike. And beneath the comedy, you feel the unease. Disease lingers in these centuries like a shadow. Plague has ravaged cities within living memory. To blame forks or fingers is easier than facing the truth that illness is merciless, and sometimes nothing saves you, not vinegar, not virtue, not even faith. So they argue, as though words themselves might ward off death. The candles burn lower, wax puddling thick. Voices rasp, cups clink, chairs scrape, yet the debate limps on, ever more frantic, as though each man must speak one last time before sleep claims him. And you, watching, listening, feel the strangeness of it all. A feast turned symposium, a dinner turned battlefield, forks and knives transformed into remedies and curses. The hour is late, the air heavy, the table littered with crumbs like tiny monuments to pride. Candles gutter low, and yet, astonishingly, the Cardinals do not relent. Their arguments grow slower now, less fiery, but all the more biting, like embers that smolder long after the fire. And the quarrel takes on its final mask, morality dressed as food. One weary bishop lifts his goblet, wine sloshing, and proclaims, "Utensils are temptations. They soften man, make him delicate. With forks, we nibble. With knives, we slice neat morsels. Without them, we wrestle, we sweat, we conquer our food like men." His voice cracks, but the words ring, echoed by nods from the traditionalists. Across from him, the fork advocate leans forward, dark circles under his eyes, but his voice still steady. Is dignity not holy? To eat with grace, to spare others the sight of grease dripping, is to honor those at table. And to honor others is to honor God. His words drift over the weary crowd like incense, soft but persistent. Historians still argue whether such moral rhetoric truly swirled around the adoption of forks or whether it was grafted on later by writers hungry for drama. But tonight, it feels utterly real, every bite a sermon, every crumb a parable. A quirky anecdote makes its rounds, offered like comic relief. A tale of a friar who condemned forks as sinful but secretly kept one hidden in his cell, using it to eat figs so neatly that not a drop stained his robe. Discovered after his death, the fork was paraded around as proof of hypocrisy or perhaps sainthood, depending on who told the story. You imagine pilgrims lining up to touch the relic of the holy fork, half in reverence, half in ridicule. Back at the table, the arguments spiral deeper. One declares that forks symbolize pride, the desire to rise above one's station. Another insists they symbolize mastery, the refinement of human progress. Knives, meanwhile, are praised as honest tools by some and condemned as violent by others. Fingers are lauded for their humility, cursed for their filth. Each utensil has become a moral compass, pointing in opposite directions depending on the hand that wields it. The musicians have stopped playing. Even the servants move slower now, as though lulled by the repetition of claims they've heard 100 times already. The hall is quieter, not calmer, more like the hush before a storm, or perhaps the final lull of a storm that has spent itself. You sip the dregs of your cup and feel the absurdity press in. This is not just dinner. It has become a theater of morality, a play where forks and knives perform the roles of saints and sinners, where grease is temptation and silver is sin. And yet the actors are weary, their lines repeated too many times, their pride fraying at the edges. A younger cleric, voice timid, suggests that perhaps, just perhaps, the morality lies not in the fork or knife but in the heart of the user. The hall pauses, considering. For a fleeting moment, it feels as though reason might prevail. But then the hawk-nosed traditionalist scoffs, a heart is hidden. A fork is seen. And it is what is seen that teaches. The fragile piece shatters, though with less fire now, more like ash stirred by a breeze. The night wears on, voices hoarse, hands stained, pride still unbroken. And you, weary too, realize the truth. This argument will never end. Forks and knives are not the subject, they are the canvas. Upon them, these men paint their fears, their pride, their longing for control in a world that shifts too quickly beneath their feet. The candles sputter, wax running like tears, shadows stretching long across the stained tablecloth. And as the arguments falter into mutters, you sense the hall itself exhale, as though it too has grown tired of serving as courtroom, battlefield, and pulpit all at once. The candles are nearly gone now, melted into stubs that sputter and smoke. The feast has long since dwindled into scraps, bones gnawed to the marrow, bread crusts hardened, wine spilled like blood across the linen. Yet the voices, though rasping and hoarse, continue to circle. Forks and knives have been called sinful, saintly, vain, practical, dangerous, and divine. And still, no agreement. One old bishop sighs, resting his chin on his palm. We began with food, he mutters, and ended with pride. His words barely rise above a whisper, but they sting. For a moment, silence washes over the hall, heavy as the smoke coiling in the rafters. Some stare into their empty cups. Others shift uncomfortably, robes rustling like dry leaves. Historians still argue whether these quarrels ever found resolutions, or whether they dissolved just as you see now, not with victory, but with exhaustion. And perhaps that is the truest reflection of human nature, not triumph or defeat, but the endless spinning of pride and fear until time itself calls the debate to bed. A quirky story drifts across the weary table, one last gasp of humor. Someone recalls a cardinal who, after decades of railing against forks, was buried with one tucked secretly into his robes. Perhaps, the teller chuckles, he wanted to twirl pasta in paradise. The laughter that follows is thin but genuine, like the last notes of a lute before the strings snap. The fork advocate, face pale with wine and weariness, lays his silver prongs on the table. Whether blessed or cursed, he murmurs, the fork will remain. Perhaps not tonight, perhaps not tomorrow, but men tire of grease, as surely as they tire of quarrels. His words ripple out softly, more lullaby than argument. No one replies. Not because they agree, but because they have no strength left to disagree. The servants move quietly now, clearing plates, dousing candles, leaving only a faint glow from the hearth. The bishops slump in their chairs, robes stained, pride bruised, eyes drooping. You sense that tomorrow they will rise, robe themselves in dignity, and pretend the night's quarrels never happened. They will preach humility, thunder about sin, and dine again with the same contradictions. Such is the rhythm of power. And you, observer, dreamer, feel the hall blur at the edges. The gold gleam of forks fades, the glint of knives dulls, the sound of voices drifts into murmurs, softer, softer still. The quarrel lingers unresolved, like an echo in a cavern. Yet in its very absurdity lies its charm, men of grandeur undone by noodles and crumbs, pride exposed in the glow of candles. Perhaps that is the true lesson, not who was right, but how fiercely people will fight over the smallest things when those things become symbols. Forks and knives were never just cutlery, they were mirrors, reflecting fear of change, hunger for status, and the stubbornness of the human heart. The last candle dies. Darkness pools. And in that darkness, the arguments dissolve into dreams. And now, as the hall fades from sight, let your thoughts drift too. The echo of voices, once sharp as steel, softens into nothing more than whispers at the edge of memory. The quarrels over forks and knives dissolve into the dust of history, their urgency gone, leaving only the faint amusement of hindsight. You find yourself exhaling, slowly, deeply, as though setting down a heavy cup at last. The Cardinals, those fiery debaters, have long since fallen silent. Their jeweled knives rest in forgotten tombs, their golden forks tarnished or lost. What endures is the simple truth that people quarrel, endlessly, lovingly, foolishly, over the tools they believe shape their world. And in those quarrels, we glimpse not their grandeur, but their humanity. Let the glow of the hearth linger in your mind's eye, warm and steady. Picture the table cleared, the scraps gone, the hall empty and still. Imagine walking alone across the cool stone floor, your footsteps fading, the echoes softening until even they are swallowed by quiet. Allow your breath to match that silence, slower now, softer now. The world of cardinals and quarrels recedes, leaving you lighter, calmer, safer. All the noise of debate, all the fire of pride, melts away like wax into nothing. You are left only with stillness, as if the very air has hushed to cradle you. There is no need to argue, no need to choose, no need to carry anything forward but peace. The forks and knives of history can rest. And so can you. Let your eyelids grow heavy. Let the warmth wrap around you like a velvet cloak. And as you drift, remember, even the noisiest feast must end in silence. Good night.